Hey babies, it's your very favorite Macy host, Mr. BMG, back at it again with another episode of the Macy's Bitch on the Internet, here to give you all of the juice happening in the streets. Let's get into it. So this past week was actually very interesting, very exciting, and we got to see lots of conversations happening about Coachella and everyone sort of anticipating to go or not to go. I've always found Coachella an interesting festival. I've never been to Coachella. Part of me is curious about Coachella, but I guess from the point of view of somebody on the outside looking into the event, it was interesting to see what people were particularly talking about, in terms of the event. And often the things that you kind of find and see are the prices. So people often talk about how Coachella is actually very expensive. It's very expensive to attend Coachella, and for most people, they kind of are hesitant to invest in all of, that financially to go to an event that may not necessarily lead up to the expectations, because I think most people, whenever they spend a lot of money, they always feel like they need to get their money's worth. And I guess for them, justifying why they charge such high prices is maybe because they are bringing a whole bunch of A-list musicians together and are asking you to basically go to a concert with all of these people in one place. So I think it's going to be maybe the price of 3 concerts, because you're kind of experiencing a lot of different concerts from a lot of different celebrities who you would have otherwise paid at least $100 to see. So I guess maybe in that regard justifies why they charge what they charge. But I think sometimes people look at festivals and going to an individual artist concert is a different thing. The value proposition may not necessarily be how many people you get to see, because I think people still see festivals as one actual event versus several events that are packaged into one. And that's why probably people complain more about festival ticket prices, because for them it's kind of like going to a concert, and you're not going to like everybody that's going to perform, but you're probably just going to want to see 1 or 2 people who you really actually bought the ticket for. So they still treat it in the same way. I do think, though, on the other side of the actual cost of going to Coachella, I think the headliners are always key to sort of attracting different markets of people. When I obviously saw that Lady Gaga was going to be performing at this year's one, that also kind of made me quite excited. Like it made the festival relevant for me more so, because one, she hasn't really performed concert style in a very long time, so I feel like people were just sort of anxious to see Gaga perform. So that was definitely always like a selling point for them. And then looking at all of the reviews of the actual performance that Lady Gaga did, and I was just like really surprised by how positive it was, because I think sometimes when people have not seen somebody perform, they could more harshly judge how they would move, because they could call them like rusty or whatever the case may be, or they haven't performed in a while. So they're trying to sort of fit the image that they had of this artist 10 years ago to how they are now. The good thing for Lady Gaga, though, is that she really outdid herself and is even better than ever, which is difficult to do, especially when you're older as an artist, and it always just reminds you of that moment where she was accepting an award. I think it was one of the award shows on Hard Radio or something like that, where she got an award, and she was kind of talking about the fact that she is 39, and she's a pop star, or whatever the case may be, and that's not old. I think there is always a tendency within the music industry that if you're not in your 20s, then you're kind of irrelevant, but I think she's definitely proved that she's still going, she still has it in her, and it's not even legacy vibes. She's literally still in her prime. And for me, that kind of also brings up the whole conversation of how Gen Z, or the talent of the 2020s, has fared in comparison to the talent of the 2010s and the late 2000s. It almost still feels like, from the general public, there's still an endorsement of the talent in the 2010s and late 2000s, because a lot of the people who are still touring and who are still able to sell out stadiums are artists that we grew up listening to and have known for a very long time. But a lot of newer artists aren't necessarily clicking with people as much, or maybe the way the system is set up now makes it very difficult for them to gain that equity that these artists were able to gain. And maybe that also just boils down to the internet age. There's just so much information, and everyone is kind of focused on many different things all at the same time, that it's difficult for somebody to be as famous as the people who were famous before them, because then there were only a few outlets which were producing information and feeding us information. So it became an institution, and because it was an institution, not everybody could essentially be famous, or fight for attention. It was just a few people who'd be fed to us and fed to us and fed to us. So that just made them way more famous than they are now, unfortunately. So that's definitely always going to be, a bigger conversation, beyond just the Coachella and, the performances. I think just the fact that these 2010 artists are still dominating and they're still headlining concerts, you know, like they are the freshest thing on the market because they've sustained that momentum. And maybe because when they came out, things were different to how things are, you know, they just haven't stuck. I also thought Tyla's performance was pretty cool at, you know, Coachella. Obviously, just watching snippets of it, you know, on the streets and online. But over and above Lady Gaga's performance, obviously, which was very solid, you know, a showstopper. Tyla also did a really, really great job and is really selling herself to the Gen Z crowd, you know, and I'm hoping that she actually sticks. And I'm hoping that, you know, beyond the 2 big songs that she has within rotation and high rotation, that is Push to Start and Water, that she sustains the momentum to create, you know, even bigger bodies of work so that she can sort of become a headliner to these, you know, particular concerts, but also a headliner to her own tour. So yeah, I think she's doing pretty well. Lisa was also doing very well. I particularly admire Lisa's choreography. I think she's got a very strong dance acumen. She can really command a stage, and it's very tight and it's precise, and very disciplined, which I always find important, you know, in a new artist, that the work ethic should translate in what you provide and you show on stage. And I think she does that quite well. And I'm sort of looking at it from, again, an insider or an outsider looking in, because I don't really listen to Lisa's music much, but the few snippets I've seen of how she conducts herself when she's performing publicly is good. You know, it's excellent, and she should continue to maintain that. I also found it very interesting to see like what type of celebrity spottings, you know, were at Coachella, and I guess the picture that comes to mind was, you know, the one where Normani is in the middle, and then there's Karrueche, and then there's Chris Brown. So I always find that also pretty interesting. Like, who's there? Who's at Coachella and watching and jamming, you know, with everybody else? And sometimes that becomes more of the topic than whoever was performing, because, you know, it just becomes socialization, and, you know, celebrity culture is currency, and beyond just them performing, just them being associated with each other, or, you know, bumping into them in a big crowd always kind of makes the event quite relevant to the masses, you know, because the masses are kind of connected to what their favorite celebrities are doing. So it was interesting to see the whole conversation with Karrueche and Chris Brown. One wonders what they were actually talking about. From what it seemed per the image, Karrueche was laughing, Chris Brown looks like was also laughing. It just looked very much like a light-hearted conversation, seemingly platonic as well, and yeah, very light and very cute. But I wonder what they were talking about, because we all know that things didn't really end well with Chris Brown and Karrueche Tran, and, you know, it may even seem that Chris Brown became very obsessed and, you know, kind of chaotic in some way, and obsessive with, you know, with the squirrel. And maybe that's also an interesting thing to see that, well, has this person evolved? You know, are they a different person? Is that why they're getting along? Or has all been forgiven? Was there something to forgive? What do we know what actually happened? Because let's also, like, not necessarily move away from the fact that sometimes people invite us into their relationships to keep their name out there, you know, particularly being a celebrity, even if generally things were quite chaotic, you know, within their situation. Was it also deliberate for them to let us know what was going on, for people to keep talking about them, you know? Because I do think that celebrities can maintain some type of privacy should they wish to, because they have the means and access to buy properties where it's very secluded, or have security, or have conversations and be in spaces where you can disallow people to take pictures around you, and, you know, basically have conversations where you can be in private. So if you are having these conversations when you're in a public platform, then in some ways you may want people to know that you're having the conversation, and that's just the media wheel. Even the whole, like, I've always like felt like paparazzi pictures mostly are not organic. Like, how would a random person know that this person is going to be at this random location at this random time? You know, somebody has leaked it somehow, and that can only come from that person's camp, whatever the case may be. So I say all this to say there's a lot of stories that we hear, and, you know, they may be tumultuous, and they may also not necessarily be the most lighthearted stories, but because any publicity is good publicity, and if people are still talking about you, then you're relevant. You may want to keep pushing your name out there, even for things that are not so good. So yeah, I wonder what they were talking about, but also, do we really care about what they were talking about? Like, is their relationship still even a factor? I don't think their relationship is really, like, of concern to the public anymore, because we've kind of moved on from that. You know, everyone's attention span is just so short nowadays, and, like, things become old very quickly, and I feel like that's old, you know. But whatever they were talking about, I hope it was good, and I hope that they're in a better place. So good for y'all, and I hope you enjoyed Coachella. Another interesting story that I found on the internet was the release of the Basketball Wives season 12 trailer. I think it was a very interesting trailer, but also nothing really unexpected, and I found that the show has become quite stale. Even though they keep on like bringing new people in, it just still feels quite repetitive and very much the same thing. The new angle that they have, I guess the big new angle they have this season is the dynamic with Jackie and her daughter, with the daughter now being an actual basketball wife and, being married to somebody within the same industry as her father, which is, very interesting to see. Very interesting to see. I hope that she is entertaining because, having watched Basketball Wives from a very long time ago, I remember her, Chantal, being on the show, but wasn't really entertaining. I don't think her personality is as big as her mother's to sort of captivate the audience and keep them going, Even though with Jackie Christie, a lot of her storylines have been frivolous, and I feel like, maybe that's a good balance that's needed on the show. She's kind of almost the opposite in some way. So it'll be interesting to see if she would be entertaining and if they'll play off against each other quite well, and if they'll actually show us a real dynamic, what the real dynamic between them is now, now that she's married and, that she's grown up and all of that stuff. So I think it'll be interesting to see if that Chantal Jackie dynamic almost humanizes also Jackie, because I think the past few seasons it's just been about her dynamic with the group versus us really knowing anything about her personal life, which, beyond just moving away from Jackie, I think that's just been the general theme with Basketball Wives in general. The focus is on the group a lot of the times, with the exception of maybe Jennifer and her relationship, but superficially we kind of got to go through her getting married and all of that stuff, but it still didn't feel like they were sharing everything with us. A lot of information and stories kind of lost in not being told or it being a rumor, and that's what I kind of dislike about Basketball Wives now. It's just doesn't feel as authentic as it once was, and the storylines about the people's families don't feel as authentic or as well told as they should be, and when there's only too much drama, or the drama that is there is just about the actual cast members, that gets old very quickly and it gets repetitive, because how many times can we see Evelyn and Jackie beefing, or sometimes Evelyn and Jennifer beefing, which, by the way, I don't even think that Evelyn and Jennifer are as close as they say they are. They've known each other for a long time, but it always just comes across as if when Evelyn is bored and she's not being with anybody, she'll somehow come for Jennifer, because I do inherently think Evelyn thinks Jennifer is a weak person, and maybe the audience may also think Jennifer is a weak person because she just is. It's difficult for her to stand up for herself. I feel like I've just never seen her standing up for herself in a way that I'm satisfied that she stood up for herself, and yeah, so I don't feel like that relationship is genuine, because I feel like deep down, Evelyn thinks that Jennifer's weak, and she can take advantage of Jennifer whenever she really feels like it. And Evelyn herself, outside of her dynamic with Jennifer, is very toxic. I think she's been in a lot of toxic relationships. And even when the relationships that she ventures into are healthy, she doesn't know it, or she somehow thinks something's missing. And for me, that's kind of always a sign that this person has a lot of internal damage that they haven't resolved or haven't, healed from. And so sometimes seeing that play out kind of frustrates me, because it's like she was in a relationship with that dude, the guy who she met on Queen's Court. Guy seemed like such a cool guy, healthy, not the toxic types that she's kind of into in general, but then it just didn't go anywhere. That storyline didn't go anywhere, and you could see that it was not going to go anywhere, because I feel like maybe she was just not satisfied. It's like she was missing something, which wasn't necessarily something healthy that she was missing, but it's because of all of that trauma she hasn't dealt with, that when she finally has somebody who's just normal, chilled, loves her, likes her, not problematic, it's like something is missing, which, yeah, for me, that just frustrated me about the whole experience. And I just be like, maybe the story that we should be told about Evelyn is the fact that she needs to heal from that. Like, we've been seeing her be on the show and beefing with everybody else, but we haven't really been through her journey and seen her in her purest form, dealing with things and healing from things. It always feels very superficial, and I think maybe the audience deserves a deep dive into her personal affairs and not superficially. I do think Basketball Wives is definitely on borrowed time. Like, I don't want to say it'll be cancelled, because maybe it'll still go on, but I just don't see why it keeps going on, because it's just so stale. Shawnee is so boring. If she's going to be in front of the camera this season, it's going to be, that's not even a draw card, because we all know that no one's going to come for her, no one's going to come, and be in her business, and that's going to be boring, because she's just a boring person, and as much as she is the supposed anchor of the show, or the executive producer of the show, she really should stay behind the scenes, and when she's behind the scenes, not even interfere on the show, because I think I hold her responsible for what Basketball Wives has become and what it could have been. So yeah, I don't know how I feel about the new season, but I'm definitely I'm probably not going to be watching, just like I haven't really watched the past I don't know how many seasons, and maybe when I do get around to watching it, it'll be like much later on, or maybe it'll just be snippets online. But yeah, lukewarm, luke cold. Viola Davis getting her Madame Tussauds statue was pretty iconic. I think it's about time. For me, I kind of equate Madame Tussauds statues as like a star of the Hollywood Walk of Fame, because that's kind of making and like memorializing who this person's character was in the form of a lifelike statue. I think is one of the highest honors ever, so I think it's about time that she got her own statue. I think she's quite iconic. She's an EGOT, and beyond her being an EGOT, I feel like she's one of the few black actresses who are mainstream. Do you get what I mean? Like, Viola Davis is kind of like an A-list celebrity actress, period. She's not a black Hollywood actress. Do you get what I mean? It's like she's there with like Meryl Streep and these big dogs of the industry with Julianne Moore and these girls, Sarah Jessica Parkers and all of those people. Like, she's up there with those girls, and it's as mainstream as I feel like you get for black actresses. And it's unfortunate that she's one of the few that are like that, and I think the only other person I could think of who was also as A-list was Halle Berry in her prime. I think she was also A-list. She's like, people don't really think of her as a black actress, in Hollywood, but as an A-list actress in Hollywood. And yeah, I feel like her work, Viola Davis, speaks for itself. I really loved How to Get Away with Murder. I think it was a very much like, if you're into psychological thrillers and just like very within, like, if you're into like intrigue, in a show, and kind of like a Sherlock Holmes type of energy as well, then How to Get Away with Murder was the perfect plot line, and really showcased her How to Get Away with Murder really showcased Viola Davis's acting prowess, and because of that, it's kind of also gotten her many other, that wasn't her like only gig, right? But I think that show was almost a crossover appeal show. It made her a staple, because the show was so popular. So I do feel like that really only benefited and boosted her, because the projects that she's done since then as well have just been really powerful, and you can see that obviously there's a big budget here. People are taking her seriously and they know her worth, and as it should be for black actresses. And I'd like to see more, being A-list and being put on the same level and receiving the type of checks that these other, I guess white actresses get. Another interesting story that I found was, this is obviously not like too recent, but I know Drake just released the video to his, song Nokia, and it's taking the internet by storm, and people are just absolutely raving about it. I think it's about time that he's vindicated through his work, because I think there has been very consistent hate towards him for the past almost year, maybe, with the whole endorsement of, Kendrick Lamar's diss track and the whole industry supporting all of that. I think where Drake always wins is his talent, right? Nobody can deny that he's a very talented musician. I'm not going to just say rapper, but he's a very talented musician, and comes across as extremely likable, just his persona. When you see him just moving in pictures and just how he carries himself is very likable. And I think to the public, because again, the public is often seeing people at face value because they don't know them like that, he's always going to win the public's hearts and, affection, and essentially always outsell everybody that he's put up against, because yeah, he's really great. Like, he's a great musician. I'll definitely have to give that to him. I think Nokia is just also a very well-made song and very catchy, and I could see that how he could see that the song was going to be a big thing, and it is, and I know that it's going to keep on doing well, and in doing that, I think maybe the industry may start to see or catch on to the fact that he may be one of those people who's just too big to cancel. Like, he's just too big to cancel. Whatever the agenda was, it flopped, unless making people hate him was part of the plot line to get people to buy into his music, i.e. just protect him because people are hating on him so much. Unless that was the plan, then it flopped, you know, what they were trying to do, icing him out, whatever the case may be, then it really flopped because he is more successful than ever, you know, Drake is more successful than ever and you continue to rise. And yeah, man, that's that on that. I feel like with Kendrick Lamar, particularly the reason why people are talking about him, and it's just unfortunate to say, but it's because he's talking about Drake. Like, he had to get clout by talking about somebody else, you know, which shows you obviously how much Drake is a big fish. So if he could get attention, which he used to get, like for me, when I think of Kendrick Lamar, I think of Bitch Don't Kill My Vibe, and for me that'll always be a classic, you know. Absolutely love that song, you know. But that's kind of maybe the Kendrick that I like, not the Kendrick that is kind of fighting maybe a beef that he doesn't really, truly and deeply care about, you know? So I feel like with him, that's where kind of things became funny when he kind of got involved in all of that. And I think he's still a great musician, a very great, talented rapper, but I think he can continue to grow his legacy without necessarily having to diss somebody else or discredit somebody else in the process. You know, they can both be great. After all, I do feel like the public is more lenient to males being great in, you know, in more than one quantity. There could be many of them and they could all be great and shine, and they don't necessarily have to be pit against each other. So yeah, man, yeah, Nokia, I hope Nokia obviously continues to do well and people continue to see him for the talent that he is. And yeah, that's the story. I do also think though that Nokia kind of sounds like, I don't know if you guys have like listened, because I feel like sometimes I always, and maybe because nothing is new anymore, right? But like I always sometimes hear music and I'm like, no, this sounds like something else, man. And I thought of Doja Cat's Need to Know. You know, if you listen to Doja Cat's Need to Know, that beat at the beginning, how it starts, and then listen to Nokia by Drake, it's the same sort of tempo. You know, obviously it evolves and changes between the two songs, but you can connect them. Like if you were to mix, you could probably mix it into each other because the tempo and the beat is kind of very similarly rooted. So, and I feel like they're not the only musicians. They're not the only musicians to have similarities in music or for things to sound similar and to have been done before. I think nothing is new anymore, but it's just about, you know, putting your own little spin. Because even if you listen to Burna Boy's Last, and then you listen to He Wasn't Man Enough by you listen to He Wasn't Man Enough by Toni Braxton, then you realize that obviously it's the same beat, it's the same thing. It's just Burna Boy's version just evolved into something different with an Afrobeats flair to it versus Toni Braxton's, you know, R&B, you know, R&B vibe, you know. So I do think nothing is new, but it's just about creating a different flavor. But it's always great when I see the evolution, I see the inspiration, especially when people just give credit, because we all know we connect with things differently and things can be done more than once and still will be successful. So thought I should point that out about Drake's Nokia and Doja's Need to Know. Anyway, babies, I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Messiest Bitch on the Internet. And as always, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you again on the next one. Mwah.